It's estimated over 100 uncontacted tribes exist today, living in remote regions of South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. It's popularly believed no groups or civilizations like this still preside in North America, with the last ones being discovered well over a century ago. That simply isn't true. Within the remote mountainous terrain of northeast Alaska and northwest corner of Canada's Yukon Territory resides an indigenous tribe, local Inuit and Inupiaq, called the Inuit cave people. Save a few meager mentions and eyewitness accounts, any information or documentation of the Inuit have been lost or are extremely difficult to find. The earliest accounts of the Inuit were mentions in the diaries of explorer Alexander Mackenzie. In 1928, a newspaper article from the town of Kaktovik notes a missing resident was reportedly venturing near cave people territory. You can also find a park ranger report from 1970 that details a Inupiaq trapper's vague encounter with one of the Inuit west of Ivavik National Park. They seem to be very opportunistic hunter-gatherers that stock up on any source of food or nutrients, which isn't limited to other humans, to get them through the region's harsh winters. The Inuit are aggressively territorial, said to even stalk or violently attack hunters, trappers, and fishermen for their catches and kills. Aside from a few eyewitness encounters, nothing, including their number of members or how long they've lived in the region, is known about the Inuit. If you ask most residents of Northeast Alaskan or Northwest Yukon Territory communities, the few who've even heard of the Inuit will merely dismiss them as a myth created by the Inuit and Inupiaq. I learned firsthand the Inuit do very much exist and are very unwelcoming to outsiders. I used to work for a communications company that developed a powerful handheld satellite radio, which provided two-way contact across great distances, regardless of the terrain or weather conditions. In the spring of 1991, I was part of a team my company sent to a series of remote locations so we could test the prototypes. Save a few fixable kinks, the radios were ultimately successful. We were sent to Alaskan Rockies, tasked with seeing how the radios performed in extremely cold temperatures. Over our 14 days in the field, the radios met every one of our expectations, giving us highly encouraging results. While heading back to civilization, however, our chopper was thrown off course by a freak snowstorm that forced us to make an emergency landing. The helicopter suffered serious damage, and although our pilots thought it was fixable, repairing it would probably take a few days. It wasn't what we wanted to hear, but we were ultimately thankful to be alive. We had very little food left, estimating there was barely enough for all 8 members for us to last for 48 or 72 hours. As a result, we had to forage, which was quite difficult given the region was freshly blanketed with a thick coat of snow. We collected a few berries, mushrooms, some other edible plants, and shot 3 or 4 squirrels, but needed something more substantial. As dusk approached on the second day, one of my colleagues named Francis radioed base camp using one of the prototypes, saying he shot a deer and needed help transporting the meat. I volunteered to help Francis, who was in a small valley about a mile from the chopper. The trek to Francis' location took about 2 hours, and it was dark by the time I arrived. He left a trail of footprints, which were easy to follow, and led me to the edge of a dense tree line. The skinned deer carcass hung by its hind legs from a tree, and it looked like Francis made decent headway in processing the deer, but he was nowhere to be seen. For context, the following dialogue occurred via the radio prototypes between 2 parties, myself, Prototype 1, and Basecamp Prototype 2. Francis also took one of the prototypes with him, but hadn't responded to my communications in over an hour.
Francis, I'm at the spot. I don't see you anywhere. It's possible the batteries in his radio died. Even if they did, I think he took a backup device, one of the regular radios. We've been trying him on that one too. Nothing. What do you see? Looks like he started breaking down the deer. It's kinda small, but should be enough to hold us over. I'll take a look around.
Although the sun had disappeared beyond the mountainous horizon, the white snow made it easier to see in the darkness. The ground directly below the dangling deer carcass was matted with blood. The tools Francis was using to quarter the deer, along with his pack, were sloppily scattered across the ground. While observing this, I noticed a dark red trail smeared across the snow, leading into the tree line. At first, I thought it was from Francis dragging the deer, but I realized its endpoint was along another tree about 7 or 8 paces from where I stood. I took a single step towards the blood trail when a distinct thump came from behind me, followed by a loud burst of
Jim,
static that
I
shattered the
think
tense
something bad may
silence.
have happened.
I almost lost my footing while pivoting to look behind me, just in time to determine the gargled, choppy static was coming from a cluster of bushes before it abruptly ceased. Canting my head, I gradually approached the bush, noting how familiar the static sounded, and made a curious discovery. The prototype Francis brought with him was caught in the brush's web of branches and leaves. I squinted in bewilderment before slowly retrieving the radio, concerned it may have been damaged and frustrated by Francis's apparent carelessness. Fortunately, the radio appeared to be in good shape. There was a small bloody smear along its side, which I figured must have been deer blood, but renewed my annoyance with Francis's evident apathy towards such expensive and pivotal equipment.
Still haven't found Francis yet, but the prototype he brought with him was in some bushes nearby. So, we would have lost that one if you hadn't come across it just now. Fuck's the matter with him? My guess is it somehow slipped off and fell in there. He'll get chewed out when he's back at base camp. Unless he's shitting somewhere, I wouldn't be surprised if Francis's goofy ass is scurrying those woods right now looking for it. Is there any indication of where he might have gone, like footprints or something?
I started looking, but scowled sharply when I couldn't distinguish my prints from any made by Francis.
You know what? It's hard to say, but I don't...
My voice trailed off as I froze in place, almost dropping the radio. While noting a cluster of mine and Francis's footprints around his tools, I realized the deer Francis shot had vanished. I was overtaken by a queasy sense of uneasiness. All that hung from the rope was a single deer hoof, looking like it had been sliced off cleanly. I then noticed a few new pairs of fresh prints that encircled the tree and dispersed back into the woods. While ours apparent by their shoe marks, these prints were narrower, featureless, and had more of a ovular shape.
Don't what? You cut out.
I stared at the radio for a few seconds before responding.
It's gone. What's gone? The deer was hanging from the tree. It's not there anymore.
Jim, our team leader, who I was on the radio with, didn't respond for about 5 seconds. During this pause, I heard something rustle in the tree line at my 1 or 2 o'clock. When I quickly faced that direction, the light from my headlamp caught the parting trails of a dark figure darting in between trees before disappearing into a thicker section of the woods. Yelping loudly, I hastily took a few steps back from the tree line's edge and conducted a frantic 360-degree survey of my surroundings.
We don't have time for jokes, Alan. We're dealing with enough bullshit for now. Are you with Francis or not? What the fuck are you guys doing out there?
I heard the branch snap loudly coming from my left. While spinning in that direction, I spotted the rifle Francis took with him leaning against a tree.
Jim, I think something bad may have happened to Francis. Something else is out there with us. What the fuck is going on there? What did Francis say? He had something happen to him?
Without answering, I shoved my radio into the pocket. I beelined toward the rifle and came within inches of grabbing the firearm when something slim and narrow struck the tree it leaned against, missing my hand by inches. To my dismay, the projectile was a wooden arrow about 6 or 7 inches long, whose stone tip was deeply embedded in the tree trunk. Prompted by a spurt of panic, I aimlessly fled into the woods away from the direction I thought the arrow was fired. Despite the deep snow, I maintained a fast pace, darting through the monotone, disorienting rows of trees as Jim's muffled voice continued to blare on the radio in my pocket. I ran for a good couple of minutes before running out of breath, realizing I headed in the same general direction as the blood trail I saw at the spot where Francis was breaking down the deer. Leaning against the tree while catching my breath, my eyes followed the smeary trail, which led to a small clearing. My headlamp revealed a person stiffly propped out against the tree, who appeared to be staring aimlessly into the woods. I was startled at first, but realized the individual in question was wearing a fluorescent orange jacket that almost seemed to glow in the light of my headlamp. It was Francis. Hey! I uttered while anxiously moving toward where Francis stood. I was about to inform Basecamp that I found Francis as I walked up alongside him, but dropped the radar at my feet while gasping in horror at the sight before me, whose image will forever be embedded in my mind. Francis was dead. I realized he was being held in a standing upright position by a thick wooden stake or branch that was impaled through his mouth, which looked to be permanently frozen in a contoured scream. Aside from his jacket, the front side of Francis's clothes were torn off, his entire chest, belly, and thighs completely skinned. Francis's entrails were partly spilling out from a massive slit-shaped opening running vertically down his front side. Large chunks of muscle were missing from his legs and arms, having been extracted with surgical precision. It looked like someone was filleting Francis's body but stopped abruptly. Looking down at the thick ring of blood-soaked snow encompassing Francis's body, I quickly noticed a series of bloody footprints, nearly identical to the ones I discovered after the deer carcass disappeared, that led into the trees. I was on the verge of vomiting when I heard a low, croaky growl come from behind me and instantly sensed the presence of another person. Holding my breath while slowly turning around, I was faced with what I originally thought to be some sort of animal, but realized it was an actual person. I didn't know it at the time, but I was staring at an actual Iuino. It looked like a male standing around my height. He had thick, shaggy, knotty hair that touched the snow-covered ground, which seemed to envelop most of his body like a wool cloak. He wore a long-sleeved top that appeared to be made from a grayish-brown animal hide with thick hair, like a bear. His legs were tightly entwined with a leathery brownish-beige hide and had footwear resembling a cross between moccasins and boots that looked very worn out and were tightly held together by twine. Aside from his clothes being covered with bloody streaks and smears, most of the Inuino's face standing before me was covered with a grayish-white human skull, while his neck and lower jaw were wrapped in a reddish-gray animal skin, likely a fox or wolverine. My heart sank, and I was convinced this Iuino would bestow the same fate onto me that Francis suffered when I saw what he held in his hands, a human heart and a stone that was blatantly crafted into a knife. We exchanged stares for about 10 seconds, like we were waiting for one another to make the next move. He started uttering a series of clicks, grumbles, and indecipherable gibberish in a scratchy high-pitched voice as he appeared to look over me with majestic wonder. I heard rustling behind the Iuino as two more emerged from the woods, standing on either side of the first one. Both had those thick shrouds of hair covering their entire backsides like capes and wore similar clothing as the first one. One's face was covered by a deer skull, while the other's was tightly wrapped in a light beige skin with 3 slit-like openings cut out signifying its eyes and mouth. The 3 briefly took their attention off me and started conversing among themselves in the same growls, clicks, and muffled mumbles that I presumed was their form of language. They were interrupted when my radio went off as Jim angrily asked why I wasn't responding. The radio appeared to startle them as all 3 excitedly jumped back and seemed to get into defensive postures while whispering among themselves. Thinking they must have been intimidated by the radio, I slowly withdrew and held it out, which caused the 3 Iuino to back away a few more steps. My instincts took over as I pressed one of the frequency buttons, which emitted a loud static, causing one of the Iuino to release a blood-curdling shriek before fleeing into the woods. I pressed the button again and started violently shaking the radio, which prompted the 2 others to retreat. Soon as they were out of sight, I wasted no time sprinting back into the direction towards base camp. One of the last things I noticed was Francis's body had been removed from the tree. Thinking about how totally unaware I was, there were only steps behind me while snatching Francis's body, and there were more than 3 I saw in the vicinity, is something that still sends chills down my spine to this day. I don't know what would have happened to me if Jim didn't call again on the radio. Despite safely returning to base camp, I was so hysterical that I locked myself in the helicopter and refused to come out until dawn. Everyone was naturally skeptical when I finally managed to explain what happened, until I reluctantly brought them back to the spot so they could see for themselves. In addition to the blood and footprints, we discovered a severed human finger with a ring on it that one of our colleagues immediately recognized as Francis's. which affirmed his death and that I hadn't gone insane. Despite our severe lack of food, we all stayed close to the chopper and felt certain the Iloino were observing us from the woods. The following day, we were spotted by a helicopter that brought us back to the civilization. The crew was with the United States Department of the Interior and filled us in on the Iloino. Turns out we unknowingly landed within a 20-mile diameter of protected territory, specifically set aside for the Iloino that the public was prohibited from entering. The DOI crew who found us was doing a periodic flyover to conduct a welfare check on the tribe. When I asked, the DOI officials we spoke with admitted the US and Canadian governments were quiet about the Iloino for their protection.
So nobody will come looking for them.
One official replied when I asked why the public weren't aware of their existence.
They've been here long before us. They just want to be left alone, and we want to leave them alone.
I can't be mad at the Iloino for what happened. We were in their territory. They know nothing about life outside their remote mountainous domain and aren't interested in learning. The loss of life was of course tragic, but ultimately a costly consequence of being somewhere we simply don't belong. My biggest takeaway from all this is there's a lot that's remained undiscovered or unknown within our world's most remote corners and furthest reaches, most of which we're better off not knowing.